Greetings. I wanted to take some time and to share with you how God taught me about the fear of the Lord. Perhaps as you see the testimony of how God worked in my life to teach me about the fear of Him, it will be helpful or beneficial to you. My first contact with the fear of the Lord was back whenever I was about 10 or 11 years old. My grandmother, who was trying to be a good religious influence in my life, sent me to many different church camps. Methodist, Baptist, Church of Christ. But at a Baptist youth camp in Lueders, Texas, I experienced the fear of the Lord, not knowing then, of course, what it was. But I knew without a shadow of a doubt that it was God who had gripped my heart. And it began a period of time where I experienced this fear of God for 3 years. I'm not going to tell you every day, but the overwhelming majority of days, every evening when I would lay down to go to sleep, the fear of the Lord would come upon me. And I knew that I had offended the Holy God. I knew that because of my sins I was deserving death. But yet I had a great fear of people. I had been a church member for several years, but I had never come to follow Christ. I did not know Christ. I knew a little bit about Him. But this fear was a dominating force in my life. And it was the force that ultimately brought me to that place where I could no longer live without the Savior. So for 3 years I had experienced the fear of God in my life. Then a few years later, as God was calling me to preach, there was a very strong experience with the Lord where I understood that if I did not accept the call to become a preacher, that God would prepare a whale for me, just like He had prepared for Noah. Maybe my whale would be in a different form, but I knew that He had something there that I didn't want to see. In my late high school years and early years as a young adult, I had many other experiences where I knew what it was to have my heart and soul gripped by God, and I knew by experience the fear of the Lord. In 1984, when God called us to be missionaries, again, a very strong, deep experience with God where He shook me to the very core of my being, and the fear of the Lord filled my heart, and I knew that I had to become a missionary. In 1991, we met Brother Roberts Richard Owen Roberts at a conference in Dallas, Texas. It was put on by the Texas Baptist Men. It was called Cedars of Lebanon. It was a group of people who met together because they were for prayer and spiritual awakening. Some very mighty men of God were speaking at these series of meetings. We would meet every year over the Labor Day weekend. One of those weekends, Brother Roberts preached about the fear of the Lord. He preached a whole series of sermons. I had never heard a sermon about the fear of the Lord before, and these really gripped my heart and soul and gave me a hunger and a thirst to know something more about the fear of the Lord. Not long after that, Elise and I went to Chicago, and we visited in the home of Brother and Mrs. Roberts, and I bought a book from him at his bookstore. The title was The Fear of God by John Bunyan. And I took that book and I began to study it, and then later to try to teach it to my students there in Smolensk, Russia. Brother Roberts had given me some very wise advice. He said that whenever he was a young man preparing to be a pastor, he knew that people would come to him for advice, and he wanted to give biblical advice, wise spiritual advice and counsel to them. So he went through the red letter edition of the Bible, and he took every verse in the red letters, in other words, the words that Christ himself spoke. He wrote each verse on a 5x7 card. And then he separated these verses by topic. And then he learned the words of Christ by topics. What did Christ say about hell? What did Christ say about repentance? What did Christ say about forgiveness? What did Christ say about any topic? And when I heard that, it seemed to me to be very wise and useful advice. So then, from that time forward, whenever I approach a new topic in the Bible or a topic that I want to study, I try to find all the verses in the Bible where it speaks about that topic. And I followed that example with the fear of the Lord. I got my concordance and I tried to find all the places in the Bible where it spoke about fear of the Lord, fear of God, and so forth. Then I arranged these and I began to study them. I did this Bible study in the King James Version. I did it in the Revised Standard Version, the New American Standard Version, the NIV, the Amplified, trying to understand what God was trying to say to us about the fear of the Lord. And by doing this study, along with the book of John Bunyan, it became clear to me that there was many different types of the fear of the Lord. And I began to try to arrange them in a way that would be logical. In 1992, my wife and I started going to Russia to minister there. And whenever I went to Russia, Elise and I tried to learn the Russian language. My idea, of course, was to reach the place where I could communicate with people without a translator, and to be able to preach and teach in Russian. That was my idea. I would use the Russian language to speak to my students and to church members. But much to my surprise, as I began to make some progress and have some understanding in the Russian language, I began to hear God speak to me in the Russian language. Before, I'd only heard God speak in the English language. And it was amazing to me that I could hear God's voice in another language. It was during this time that a group of missionaries would meet off and on in our home there in Smolensk, and we would pray for each other and for the various needs of the work there in Smolensk. My prayer at that time was that God would give me wisdom. This was a time in Russia in the early 90s when many people wanted to hear about God, and I wanted to have wisdom about how to speak, what to speak, and how to minister in the best way to these people. Of course, now I know that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And whenever we prayed for me to have wisdom, this is, I believe, without a shadow of a doubt, then God answered that prayer by opening up to me this hunger and thirst to know more, to know about the fear of God and to know more about Him. It was during this time, one summer, we were helping a church in Yelga to have a Bible camp, and we had a group of Americans coming to help us, and we had a group of about 8 or 10 Russian translators who were helping us. Every morning we would have Bible class, and then for the Bible camp in the afternoon during free time. And then the translators would meet with me, and we would study the Bible. They had been studying the Bible with me for a good period of time, although at that time none of them had begun to follow Christ. But during the Bible study, one of the young ladies asked me, "Kenny, what is the fear of the Lord?" Even though I had experienced the fear of the Lord, I had never studied what the Bible said about the fear of the Lord at that particular time. In fact, this was in July, and it was the Labor Day after this whenever I first heard Brother Robert speak about the fear of the Lord. At that time, I had been preaching, say this is 93, 94. I had been preaching since 1972. I began to pastor a church in 1973, so I had many years as a pastor, as a Bible teacher. So I was ashamed to admit that I didn't know what the fear of the Lord was, and so I told her a definition that's similar to what most people would say when they don't know what is the fear of the Lord, but someone asks. I said, well, you know, it's not fear like you're afraid, it's fear like respect. Love, admiration, respect. And that is a tiny, tiny portion of what is the fear of the Lord. But it leaves out, I left completely out the fear of the Lord, which is God's name and God's nature. I knew nothing of the fear of the Lord, the terror of the Lord, the dread of God. What does it mean to stand in awe or the awesomeness of God, reverence or worship? I knew none of that. And so, unfortunately, I gave a very poor, inadequate response. But then later, as God, after hearing Brother Robert speak about the fear of the Lord and beginning to read and study about it myself, I was able to go back with these group of translators and then to begin to teach them really and truly what does the Bible say about the fear of the Lord. Okay. After I had heard Brother Robert speak, after I had done the Bible verses, all the Bible verses I could find about the fear of the Lord, and as I was preparing the Bible lessons to teach Russian church members about the fear of the Lord, as I would look in the Russian Bible, I would see that many of the words that the Russian Bible called fear, speaking about the fear of the Lord, in English other words were used. Maybe dread, maybe awe, maybe terror. And so as I saw this and began to go back and look into the Hebrew language, why did the Russian Bible pick the word fear for a particular verse, and in English they didn't? Then through that, as I began to compare the Russian Bible to the English Bible, God began to show me that there were many different words in the Bible that actually spoke about the fear of the Lord, even though the word fear was not mentioned in the verse. So then, using an Englishman's concordance, I found all of the Hebrew words that were translated fear in the Bible. And then I compiled a list of all of these verses. And it's this list of verses that has over 1,000 verses about the fear of the Lord. And I began to see that in the Hebrew language, that these more than 20 words that spoke about fear, that each one of them that God used those words on purpose, that they spoke about a part of the meaning of the fear of the Lord that we might miss had he not done so. And in the future lessons, it's my plan to share with you those words that are used about the fear of the Lord. I often call them the hidden words that speak about the fear of the Lord. I have alluded to them in some of the other lessons, for example, dismayed, discouraged, but there's other words also. It was also during this time I tried to buy every book that was in print today about the fear of the Lord. Some of these books were helpful. Some of these books really just showed how little the author knew about the fear of the Lord. It was during this time that God led me to try to understand why all of these different English words were used to speak about the fear of the Lord. The fear, terror, dread, tremble, awe, reverence, worship. And I began to go back and to search out, try to find old dictionaries. The older the better. And I was very fortunate. I was able to find dictionaries from the 1800s, 1700s, one even from the 1600s. That I would read how these words were used back then and how they're used today. And of course we understand that the English language changes very, very rapidly. I've alluded to it before about the word gay, where it used to mean happy and joyful, now it means homosexual. The word terrible used to be, in its original form, used to mean able to inspire terror or dread. Now it means something like really, really bad or extremely bad. And so our language has lost much of its meaning. There was a time when the biblical meaning controlled the meaning of the word just in common everyday usage. But as we have lost the fear of the Lord, that is no longer the case. And now the common ordinary usage of the word is used to control the biblical meaning. Before, the Bible controlled the world in the usage of words. Now, the world controls the Bible in the usage of words. And this is a very serious problem, and one that shows how we have lost the fear of the Lord and need to return to God. So after I did this research in the dictionaries, then Brother Roberts pointed me to some sermons about the fear of the Lord that were written back in the 1700s and the 1800s. And it was a great blessing to find that a library here in Abilene, Texas has on microfiche all of the books, pamphlets, so on that were published in America from the time of the first printing press in America up until the early part of the 1900s. So I spent many hours reading sermons about the fear of the Lord from this earlier period. And in fact, one of those sermons, the nature and character of godly fear, I am working on translating it and updating it so that it can be published in the near future, because this sermon had a great impact in my life. But as I read these old sermons, I came to realize how what used to be a common topic, the fear of the Lord, is now lost. In fact, I had been a pastor for 13 years and a missionary for 7. So I've been preaching 21 years before I ever heard my first sermon on the fear of the Lord, or even if there was no lessons about it in Bible college, the 5 years of Bible college. it wasn't spoken about. Maybe it's a little more today than it was, but still not what it should be. And in this one sermon, I learned that the fear of the Lord should be inculcated. Now, I always thought I had a fairly large vocabulary, but I had no idea what inculcate was. And so I looked it up, and it means to teach often and by repetition, to constantly teach and speak about these things, so that by repetition and by constantly speaking, people are learn. The fear of the Lord is inculcated in the Bible. As I said, over 1,000 verses speak about the fear of the Lord. And it is one of the major themes of the Bible. In fact, I have come to understand now it's impossible to understand what the Bible teaches if we do not know the fear of the Lord. I thank you for listening to my testimony about the fear of the Lord. It is my prayer that God would unite all of our hearts so that we would always fear Him. May God bless you.